Afternoon. First, I'd like to say I extended a great deal of appreciation for the invitation to be here to the Magnolia Corporation and all its community. I think what you're embarking here is something courageous, and we're really pleased to be part of that. I also want to thank my fellow speakers. I've learned a lot from each and every one of you today, so thank you so much. I hope I can share a little of my knowledge with you. But as I'm here with you today, my team is back in Boston sleeping. It must be 4 in the morning for them. But it really takes a village, I think, to address issues as complex as development, urban development. So I have a staff of architects, city planners, urban planners, and also on my team, I'm working with Laura Kabansky, a fellow faculty member, and her expertise is the social determinants of health. And by the way, if you note, she is the director now, or co-director, of the Kum Yung Sung Center for Health and Happiness that has just been established at Harvard University. So working on this project has allowed me to collaborate with faculty that are far different than myself and what we do. So everything you said, Professor Singh, is true about nature. The evidence is building every single day with new publications. Now, that tree is full of 100 bird species, for sure, but nature does these things for us. So this is just one measure of the eco-services of nature. Restores our attentiveness, reduces our stress, creativity, cognition. So it's so important and fundamental to us. But here we are in 2018, and if you check the world, if you check with nature, nature's not doing too well. Nature is suffering us. And what you see on the left side of this figure is the metaphor for how we thought about sustainable development for the last 25 years. Ever since the first World Summit, Rio, 1992, we thought, well, we will have sustainable development, and it'll be the merging of caring about the economy first, caring about environment, caring about society, and at that little intersection, we'll call that sustainability. This needs to be reframed, and reframed quickly. And what's being proposed now out of the UN and out of academic institutions, like Harvard, a fellow faculty member, Bill Clark, just published a book called Pursuing Sustainability, where they articulate that we need to build 5 capitals, capital assets. We got to grow the strengths. Here are 3 of them. We got to build our natural capital. And that isn't just forests, that's sequestration of carbon. We have to improve our oceans, our water surfaces, our water contaminations into our rivers. We got to build natural capital. How good is your solar potential in your country, or your wind potential for renewables? How good are your coastal boundaries with mangroves to protect against storm surge? These are the natural capitals that we have to build. We have to build human capital, and we heard it from the last speaker. Even in the aging population, there's human capacity, tremendous human capacity. That's the wisdom and the knowledge of their generations and experiences transformed. How do we build our human capital? How do we make our people not just live longer, but have purpose and have meaning to what they do in life? And so that's an important asset that has to be built. And it plays out in the workplace. Meaningful, responsible, impactful work, the relevance, to people thrive in their lives, not just exist. And we got to build social capital, and this is so critical in the world today. How do we build the values, the norms, the strengths of society, building our human capital? So this is what has to change. So at Harvard, I'll just say, this project that we're doing in Bangkok, with Magnolia gives us the possibility of taking the research that we do in looking at the effects, health effects of nature, the research we're doing to curb diabetes and obesity through physical exercise, take our research on air pollution, noise, water impact that we do on big communities, and shorten the time between our scientific publications of evidence into practice. Over my career, it would be typical that we would do work on air pollution health effects, and 10 years later, 15 years later, another discipline might recognize it and start to incorporate it in their professional activities. That doesn't work anymore. We need radical collaborations like this, like foresting, to shorten that time span. Well, let me just start. I'm going to talk about the natural environment. I'm going to talk about happiness, wellness, well-being, and then to the built environment. But this should not, now that we have some more evidence about health in nature, it wasn't a surprise for E.O. Wilson, entomologist at Harvard, who gave us the conceptual way of thinking about biophilia, love of life. We're hardwired to nature. We're enthralled. We need nature for our spirit and maybe for many more things. And to take then that work with his colleague, Stephen Kilnett, and say, how do we build this into design? And so they both were champions in this field. And I submit to you, those that are interested, this review in the American Review of Public Health, 2014, where it looked at the literature, and they said the literature was sparse before the year 2000 about the linkage between nature and well-being. And they started to see some early publications in the 2000s, and now it's a vital, active field of research. Partly because social media has given us the ability to track people and get their responses immediately, satellites that allow us to look at how green spaces are down to small unit sizes, social media to gather sentiment, how people respond to their physical environment and natural environment. So there's been a tremendous growth in this field. And so they lay out a proposition, and we often do this in epidemiology. We say, all right, there's something acting on people. The endpoints are health and well-being. Through what mechanisms do we expect a pathway, associations or causality? How do we think this will act? And so if we have the natural environment, we have to understand the contact that we have with it. And this is how we might define our research, people that have much more contact and others that have less. But how is it acting? Is it giving us better air quality? Or is it giving us pollen and allergens? Is it reducing noise stress on populations? Is it working through access to physical activity? Is that the mechanism by which we have better outcomes? Is it acting to increasing social contacts and therefore lifting spirits and lifting and building the fabric, the connective tissue within community? But clearly, a lot of the research was on stress. It's either attention restoration or stress reduction, but that's where the bulk of the research has been, well grounded in psychological theory, to say that this actually has benefits. And this is what Professor Sang talked about. So we talk about nature being a part of social engagement, social contact. All you need to do is create a dog park, and anyone who has animals know that this is a great convening, or have kids in playgrounds where you just start to connect with other human beings. It reduces the isolation. You share common values in these settings. But let me take you back to this property in Bangkok that's being developed. And what you're seeing here are circles, 250 meters out to 1,000 plus meters. And these kind of scales have been used where we and others have taken satellite data and analyzed the greenness of communities down to small scales. And in a study done by my colleagues at Harvard, where they tracked 250,000 people mostly nurses, over 30 years, located exactly where they lived, put the satellite images to get the greenness indicators. They found that if they lived in the highest quartile of green in their community, that they had 12% lower mortality. And that applied out to 1,000 meters. We did the same thing with student test scores in elementary schools. Their math and English scores went up in the communities that had more green around the schools. I gave that data set to my colleague, Murray Middleman, who's a cardiologist, and he had a data set of stroke survivors. And he said, well, let's see how these 14,000 stroke survivors do. How many live after 5 years? And sure enough, 22% increase in survival in the highest quartile of green. So we're beginning to gather this kind of observational evidence to say that these things are linked together. So I applaud the courageousness of a development that is going to take these ideas and incorporate them into the design, whether it's the exercise loop or places for convening, deeply embedded wood in this interior forest into this development, back into an urban area, as you said, that has very few square meters per person of nature. And do this and hopefully create a sense of awe. And Bill, this is how it presents. This is what you want to invoke in people, the appreciation of being in those spaces. And you have choices. You have a variety of choices. I just give you these two examples. These are places of social convening. Could be a cafe, could be a little square. One with biophilic concepts, one without. They might serve the same function, but you're getting the eco-benefits of shading, maybe water absorption, cooling of that surface, closeness, so you're not distracted. So there's a wonderful variety of design, how you can build nature into this. Some of the evidence comes from studies like this. I just picked this out as an example of some of the evidence. So in Finland, these researchers took subjects and they took them to different places. A forest, a city, street, and in an urban park. And made many measurements. This is measurements of vitality, and it has other attributes. Another measurements of relaxation, calmness, a sense of meditation state. And you can see the differences. You're not going to get that experience sitting on the curbside out here. It might be an interesting place to observe people, but it's not going to have this restorative nature. So there's more evidence in that. A few years ago, it became widely known that Bhutan was the happiest place in the world. They had the gross domestic happiness indicator. So the world got really caught up. In fact, the UN started the Bhutan Initiative, a whole 2-year investigation as to what are those attributes. What does make people happier with their existence? It's popularized here in the November issue of National Geographic. Well, we look at a lot of these indicators to say, is there some real predictability behind these things? So here is one that we happen to like. This is the happiness index, and the website is listed there. And they put out an equation that happiness is a function of well-being, self-reported, life expectancy, inequalities, and as Toby shared, divided by the ecological footprint, the hectares of nature that we must extract per capita, per person. So there's some of the basis for their indices. And they plot this out worldwide. And I want to point out that wellness and well-being, a sense of well-being, doesn't necessarily have to be synonymous with happiness. This shows you quite graphically that on this side, you see, this is the well-being index. And there are a lot of countries, sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Africa, other places, whose well-being is not good. I think we know this from our own observations and how we understand the world. And yet, if you look at happiness, you see something that's somewhat consistent in certain places, but inconsistent in other places. And you see great red swaths across the United States, and a changing indication, and Russia. And if they take this and they plot out several things in this graph, horizontally, it is your ecological footprint. So here the United States is way over to the left here, or your right, having a high ecological footprint, not very high up on the happiness or wellness indicator. The vertical axis is number of years of happy living. It's a strange combination. It's not life expectancy. They have this sort of looking at the burden of disease and subtracting that. So it's another measure. So you see top at the list is Norway, but not top at the list in terms of national happiness. That's Costa Rica. So, and every country's plotted this way. So I just want to compare then Costa Rica, who comes in number 1, with Thailand, that is number 9 in the world. And way over here is the United States, what does that say, 108 or so in the world? And then some of the indicators that go in this thing. So that's at the international level, comparisons across countries. Why would someone even do this? Well, this is going to be important and probably was very much part of the groundwork behind the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You know, how do we address the inequities in the world? The deprivation of water, sanitation, clean energy sources, air pollution in urban areas, poor infrastructure. And so how does that now relate to well-being and to happiness? So we need to learn how to use these indicators. Let me move to the city level. Vancouver. We've looked at a lot of indicators around the world. We really like what Vancouver has done. mycommunitymyhealth.org. You can access this. You can look at small municipalities. They have detailed geographical subdividing all the way up to nearly Whistler, out to the Fraser Valley, down to the Delta, where it borders with the United States. Huge database of the health and well-being down to small community size. And they're beginning to use it in a planning metrics. So I'm shocked by this. So this is metropolitan Vancouver. Only 49% of the people think they're in excellent health. They think they're in better mental health than in physical health. Connected to other people, 4 people in your lives that you can connect to. That's your personal capital, human capital. If in time of stress or need, only 45%. And look at the strong sense of community. And they develop these relationships, doing analysis of how do these things interplay. And then what do you do with social programs, public investment to change that? This flips to coastal communities. I'm going to go back and forth. Look at some of these numbers. Look at sense of community, 74% versus 56. Look at connected to other people. All right, so that is metropolitan. Whoops, I went all the way backwards, sorry. And that jumps to 40%. It turns out that there's a city deficit here across many of these indicators that seem to be better in smaller rural communities. So what is the fabric of those communities? And how will we build that in if we're going to now build a community within an urban context? Moving on. Oh, I keep going backwards here. So my physiology is 4 o'clock in the morning too, so. All right. So Winston Churchill said many things. Apropos to the built environment, he said this: first we shape our buildings, and then our buildings shape us. So think about this. In many population studies, we, human beings, are 90% of our time indoors. We spend in transit, in our work, in our offices, in our homes. I think in Thailand it's 10% in malls. I'm convinced of this. And that's shaping us in a real fundamental way. Certainly the family unit shapes who we are, gives us a definition by those relationships to our parents, to our brothers, to our sisters, to our other family members. That happens in the family. It happens in our homes. And at work, it shapes our relationships. But how do we think about this? Turns out we don't give much thought because we think these are safe places. Someone else is taking care of it. But we know from lots of research going back 20, 30 years that things that we do in our indoor environments are harmful. Whether it's asthma, cancer, neurological, birth outcomes, lower respiratory infections, we know we pay a price. And what do our governments do? They care about outdoor air pollution, right? They haven't paid the same amount of attention to indoor environments. And then I say, look over the horizon. Modern chemicals. These chemicals didn't exist 50 years ago. They're in our plastics. They're in our coatings. They're in our fabrics because they give us great properties. They're antimicrobials. They're made up of strong chlorine, bromine, fluorine bonds. The strongest bond in nature is the chlorine-fluorine bond. This does not break down. It will go right out our wastewater, out of our wasted products. It'll go into the food chain. It'll go right up through higher order species and end up in the food chain of people remote from here. Studies coming out of the Faroe Islands, way above in the North Atlantic, because eating whale, eating blubber, eating fish has put these chemicals in their body and has compromised their immune system. So I am delighted to know that there is a resource right here that says, how do we specify materials that decrease the toxicity of our indoor environments? Because the literature is emerging all the time, linking adverse outcomes to the in utero exposure, early childhood exposure to many of these chemicals. And this has got to stop. And we cannot rely on our governments. Children born in North America have a very high chance of having dozens of these chemicals in their body the moment they're born, because they get it from their mothers, or then they get it through the breast milk. There is hope. We know how to do it better. We know how to make our buildings healthier. We share this with the world, the 9 foundations for healthy buildings, on our website. We put all our research, which is not just ours, but it's summarizing the vast literature and making it available to other professions, on our website. And it's there. It's Healthy Homes, 9 foundations for healthy buildings, working on sensors for health. So it's available. All right. So we can make our buildings healthier, make our homes healthier. What about that last point? What we build today will live deep into this century. This will be, those buildings, those houses, residentials, those hospitals will be around maybe to the end of the century. But they're built for a climate that we just had. And this is the big concern, the existential threat of climate change. We know it. This year and last year, the end of last year, we know it. The fires in California, the biggest on record. Now the mudslides. Hurricane Irma, Harvey, Maria. Never did we have Category 5 and 4 hurricanes all active at the same time in the Atlantic Ocean. Floods and this is worldwide. The slow Armageddon of climate change is occurring. Are we ready? So this is data from Mauna Loa. We're already past 410 parts per million CO2. What does the Paris Agreement say? We can't go above 450. The course we're on, there is no way we're stopping at 450. Scientists know right now we have to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Take it out. Part, forest sequestration, changing agricultural practices. What does it mean? The hotter the earth is, the more moisture that atmosphere can hold. Moisture means energy. That's why we have category 4 and 5 hurricanes and typhoons. That's why we have torrential rains where we never had them before, because there's more moisture in the atmosphere if that atmosphere is warmer. Are we ready for this? So I share this picture. It's because I like the picture. It's Mesa Verde, the Anastasi Nation, lived in this development for years along with others close by. Look at their design. They had the same urban planning. They had public spaces. They had private spaces. They had religious places. They had group artisans and food preparation. They lived close to nature, the water right in the valley, the agriculture in the valley, hunting on the plateau, on the mesa. And yet they built into the cliff because their existential threat was warring neighbors and parties. That was a physical threat. So that's what they built into their environment. Little did they know that climate disruption ended their civilization 1,000 years ago. So how ready are we? Do we rely on the wisdom of vernacular architecture? Do we think, because there was a lot of sensible architecture around the world that fit the location. It's remarkable. You go to the Middle East, as many of my colleagues have been, and you said, my gosh, who thought of high reflective windows? Why is this going to work in a climate that has the temperatures that they do and the bright suns that they do? Ancient wisdom said no. That's not how they designed. So we're looking at these changes. And those that are from the Caribbean have recognized that if they cannot tolerate the losses that we had with Maria and Irma and Harvey. So if you want to live in those regions, some have been absolutely devastated. It'll be years before they come back. Electricity's still out in Puerto Rico and many places. So how do you think differently about design for that existential threat? All right, so I'll wrap up by saying, how do we know that Foresta can be generalizable? If it is a metaphor for change, if it's how we should be building our cities and our structures, how will we know it? How will we know if we built social cohesion? If we created value to the ecosystems? Improve the well-being of people? There are a lot of brilliant designs here that are being shared by other speakers. How do we know that this is going to work? Turns out we need the evidence, because it won't influence others until the evidence is available. And that's the courageous part of what is happening here. So how do we get that evidence? How do we know nature, society, well-being is improved? Fortunately, the tools are available. We can measure things on individuals at that moment in time, facial recognitions, momentary responses, and we can track it all the way up with big data sets on hospital outcomes, on senior living outcomes. We can track these things and build a system along with building a physical property, build the data collection system. So let me just share. Coming out of MIT, facial recognition technology, commercialized now. 10,000 images to verify this. It started off on a whim by some doctoral student, put up facial recognitions, and they showed how sad people were at exam time. Didn't need technology for that. But it showed how people's mood changed with weather. But this has great potential for good, not just catching people, but for good. All right, so that's available now. Social media, getting access to social media to gather how people feel and what words they choose. So this sentiment analysis looks at tweets, takes positive words, negative words, happy words, sad words, and creates data here on the large scale for the whole United States, where blue are the sad people, Red are the happy places. Now, with the election that we had just a year ago, it's flipped around. We're the unhappy people. But if you can see the colors here, maybe it doesn't come up, but throughout the Rust Belt, throughout the South and the Southeast, a lot of blue. Unhappiness with whatever reason that might be. Disenfranchisement of the system. But places that are happy, the Pacific Northwest, Colorado, San Francisco, Los Angeles area, Boston, some of the other places are happier than others. So why is that? What are this data now can be done at a smaller scale. I've seen data like this in Hong Kong, right down to a block level to start looking at physical infrastructure. Apps are coming along where you can be a member of this, join the app at that moment, sense the air quality in your environment, ask you to respond to that, do a cognitive test right online, map out your location where you are. This is all available to us now and being used. And we can do it to the person. We can use wearable devices to get blood pressure, heart rate variability, skin conductance on stress, and these are the kind of studies we're doing right now. And we can measure your sleep quality that is linked to your physical well-being, cognitive function, and tie this together. So we should take advantage of these things as we go forward. So in conclusion, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to create a happy, well-being place to live and work. It is an opportunity to understand how these things matter and to make sure people with that information gets conveyed, because that's the only way we're going to change a much larger effort across the world and how to rethink development. And let me end with this quote. I really appreciated this. And this fits to exactly, Professor Singh, what you said. And it is conceptually so important that it's said this way. And for Rista, we must take care of the snakes, the birds, the insects, because it was their home first. Western thinking, it doesn't compute this. This is deeply Eastern thinking, which we need to have perfused throughout the world. So thank you.